It was just another late night at the cabin, a trip I'd been looking forward to for weeks, but now felt like something out of a dream I didn't want to wake up from. The air smelled different here. Cool, crisp, like it held secrets only the mountains knew. The kind of place where time slowed down, and I could forget about everything back home. Or at least, that's what I told myself when I agreed to come. I wasn't supposed to be alone with Jack. At least not in the way it was happening. Jack, my best friend Drew's dad. A man I'd known my whole life. A man I respected, sure. But this was unexpected. We had arrived at the cabin with Drew, and for the first few hours, everything was just as I expected. Laughter, drinks, the usual banter that comes with a weekend getaway. But then Drew had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the long drive, and Jack and I were left to clean up. He'd offered to take care of the dishes, so I had excused myself to the porch to breathe, to process the confusing tension that had been hanging in the air since we'd arrived. It wasn't anything new. There were always small moments between us, quick glances that lingered just a bit too long, gestures that seemed too deliberate. But I had always chalked it up to my overactive imagination. I mean, he was Drew's dad. He was off limits in every sense of the word. But tonight, something was different. I could feel it. The night was unusually quiet, save for the sound of the trees swaying in the breeze and the faint crackle of the fire inside. I stood on the porch, looking out at the stars, trying to settle my racing thoughts. My heart was pounding a little too hard in my chest. I had no idea what was going on with me. What had started as an innocent weekend had quickly turned into something far more complicated. Need some company? Jack's voice startled me from behind, and I turned to see him standing just inside the open door, his face half-shadowed in the low light. He was leaning casually against the door frame, a cigarette in one hand. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. As though he was as comfortable with this as I was uncomfortable with it. I smiled, trying to hide the tension in my shoulders. "Yeah, I was just thinking about how quiet it is out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jack took a drag from his cigarette, his eyes scanning the night before meeting mine. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something that made my skin feel too tight, too aware of him. "Quiet's good," he said with a slow smile. "Sometimes, it's all you need to figure things out." I didn't know what he meant by that, but something about his tone made my stomach flip. He stepped outside and joined me on the porch, standing just a little too close. The space between us felt charged, electric. My eyes flicked toward him, unsure if I should say something, anything, to break the silence. But no words came. All I could do was breathe, my mind racing, trying to figure out why I was suddenly so hyper-aware of him, of the way his scent clung to the air around him, the warmth radiating off his body, the way his hand brushed against mine when he moved to rest his cigarette in the ashtray. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that something had shifted. Something was different tonight, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what that something was. I've known Jack as long as I've known Drew, since I was barely old enough to remember, really. Jack's one of those guys who's easy to be around, always the life of the party, cracking jokes, sharing stories that are half-truths and full of charm. He's the kind of person you just gravitate toward, the kind you can't help but laugh with, even when you're too tired or annoyed to care. Growing up, I never thought much about him beyond the fact that he was Drew's dad, a figure who felt like a part of the background. He was always there, providing that fatherly presence without it ever being anything more than that. Until recently, I never really noticed how different he was from the other dads I knew. Most of the other fathers were stiff, distant, or stuck in their own routines. Jack, though, was easygoing, someone who could tell you to stop being an idiot, but do it with a grin that made you feel like you were his friend first, his kid's friend second. But something shifted over the years. Maybe it was the moments alone with him after a hike, or the random times Drew was off with friends, leaving Jack and me to chat in the kitchen. These moments didn't feel like the usual small talk. There was something deeper there. It started with small things. I remember one summer when Drew and I stayed at their house for a few weeks, and Jack asked me if I wanted to join him on a fishing trip. No big deal, I thought, just another trip with Drew's dad. But that day, there was a subtle difference in the way Jack interacted with me. He wasn't the same father figure he used to be. We'd been sitting by the lake, sharing beers as the sun started to dip below the trees. Jack had been talking about life, about how things never seemed to go the way you planned, how you could try all you wanted but sometimes it just didn't happen. I didn't know what it was, but I found myself hanging on every word, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. He wasn't just telling me stories. He was letting me in, offering bits of wisdom that felt like they came from somewhere deep inside of him. "How about you?" he had asked, his eyes shifting over to me as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "What's your story, kid? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" I had shrugged, the question catching me off guard. 5 years felt like a lifetime at the time. "I don't know. I guess I'll figure it out when I get there." Jack had smiled, a knowing smile that told me he didn't expect a perfect answer. "That's the spirit," he'd said. "You don't have to have it all figured out yet. Life's a lot about getting lost and finding your way again. You'll be fine." I didn't know why, but I found his words sticking with me long after we packed up and left the lake that day. It wasn't just the advice, but the way he said it, as if he truly believed in me, in the possibility of what I could be. There was something about the way Jack made you feel like you were capable of more than you knew. We'd spent more time together since then, but nothing had ever crossed a line. I don't think either of us ever wanted it to. He was Drew's dad, and I was his best friend's kid. That was how it was supposed to stay. But over the years, our relationship evolved, even if I didn't quite understand it. I'd catch him, looking at me differently when we'd share moments alone, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long, like he was seeing something he hadn't before, and I'd look away quickly, pretending I didn't notice. Drew and I had gone on countless trips together, camping, hiking, or just hanging out at the cabin. It was always the three of us, Jack, Drew, and me. But this trip was different. Drew had stayed back to handle some work stuff, leaving Jack and me alone for the first time in a while. I hadn't really thought much of it when Drew had said his goodbyes. I had never expected it to feel this strange. I had always considered myself as someone who could roll with the punches, who could adapt to whatever situation came my way. But now, with Jack standing there beside me on the porch, so close that I could feel the warmth of his presence without him even touching me, I wasn't so sure of anything anymore. My heart was racing in a way it hadn't before, a way I didn't know how to explain. "So, what do you think?" Jack asked, breaking the silence between us. He was still leaning on the doorframe, cigarette burning low in his fingers. "You got any big plans for the future?" I forced myself to focus on his words, but my mind was elsewhere, circling around the same question I'd been trying to avoid. What were we doing? What were these strange moments between us that felt more like something real than just harmless conversations? Why did I feel this pull when he was close? But instead of answering, I just shrugged again, offering him a half smile. Same as always, figuring it out as I go. Jack looked at me, his smile softening, a look passing between us that felt like we were both thinking the same thing. This wasn't just small talk anymore. This was something else. That night, after dinner, the air was thick with something unspoken. Jack and I had retired to the back porch, where we often hung out after a long day, sipping beers and talking about everything and nothing. But tonight felt different. There was something on the horizon, something waiting to happen, and I couldn't put my finger on it. The temperature had dropped, a chill creeping into the air as the stars began to emerge, twinkling against the velvet sky. We were both sitting in the same old folding chairs, but the space between us felt more like a chasm than a casual gap. It wasn't the distance in inches that mattered, but the one in our minds, the one that had grown too large to ignore. Jack took another drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing brightly in the quiet night. I could smell it, earthy, sharp, lingering in the cool evening air. I never liked the smell of cigarettes, but for some reason, with Jack, it didn't bother me. Maybe it was the way he handled everything, the way he carried himself. Or maybe it was just that I was more aware of him now than I'd ever been before. "Ever been out this way in the winter?" Jack asked, his voice breaking through the silence. I shook my head, trying to keep my mind from wandering. "Not really. Drew usually gets us out of here before the snow starts to fall." "Yeah, Jack chuckled, his voice warm, almost too warm for this time of night. Drew's not one for the cold, is he? I laughed, though it didn't feel as genuine, as usual. Not exactly. Jack's eyes met mine for a second. Something there I couldn't place. You know, he said, pausing as if considering his next words carefully. I always thought you were a lot like him, but lately, I've been seeing a lot more of you in you. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile I could quite read. I felt a strange flutter in my chest, my breath hitching in my throat. I wanted to say something back, to joke about how I had always felt like a shadow in Drew's presence. But the words wouldn't come. There was a weight to his words that made the space between us feel even tighter, like a rope drawing us closer together whether we wanted it or not. Then, without warning, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill through the air. It wasn't a big storm, but the sudden gusts felt more like nature pressing in on us, reminding us of how fragile the comfort we'd built around each other was. The porch swing rattled, its chains creaking as if the wind had a mind of its own. "You're cold," Jack said, his gaze flicking to my arms, where goosebumps had already risen. "Come on, I've got an extra blanket inside." I didn't protest. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have insisted that I was fine, that I didn't need any help. But the invitation sounded too tempting. So I stood, following him through the back door into the house, the warmth of the interior, a stark contrast to the bite of the wind outside. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the wooden floors beneath our feet. Jack moved easily, like he had 1,000 times before, but I felt like an intruder in this space. His house had always felt like his own, a place where Drew and I were the guests. But tonight, for some reason, everything felt different, like the house was alive with the quiet tension between us, and the walls were listening, waiting for the next step. Jack turned toward the hallway, pulling a blanket off the back of the couch. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine in the process. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through me, a spark that I wasn't prepared for. It lingered too long, just enough for me to feel the heat from his skin. I quickly wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, trying to steady my breathing. "Thanks," I muttered, my voice unsteady. "No problem," Jack said, his tone casual, but his eyes seemed to linger on me for a moment longer than normal. "You all right? You seem a little off tonight." I tried to laugh it off, but my smile felt thin. "Just tired," I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. But I couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't tell him that something about being so close to him was making it hard to breathe, that my body felt too alive, too aware in his presence. Jack nodded, like he didn't fully believe me but wasn't pushing. "Well, let me know if you need anything else," he said, turning to head back to the kitchen. But I couldn't stop myself. I reached out, my fingers brushing his arm, just a quick touch. Nothing more than a fleeting contact. But when I pulled my hand back, Jack stopped. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, the entire room felt charged, like the air had thickened with an unspoken understanding. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Are we okay? I don't know what's happening, but something feels off. Like, I don't know. Maybe I'm just overthinking things." Jack didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his gaze intense, almost searching. And then, with a small shake of his head, he took a step forward, closing the distance between us. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. His body language spoke volumes, the tension, the hesitation, the pull that neither of us could deny anymore. And then he did something unexpected. He cupped my face in his hands, his fingers warm against my skin. His touch wasn't rough or demanding. It was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he was unsure of what came next but couldn't pull away. And I, for the first time in my life, didn't want him to. He was so close now. His breath mingled with mine, and I could feel the heat between us. I could see the slight tremble in his hands, the way his eyes flicked between mine and my lips. In that moment, every second that passed felt like a lifetime. I wanted to lean in, to bridge the gap between us. But a part of me feared what might happen if I did. This wasn't just a friendship anymore. It couldn't be. Whatever this was, it was too real, too undeniable. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to break the silence. But before I could, Jack spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. This feels wrong, doesn't it? I froze, unsure of how to answer. Was it wrong? Or was it just the thing I had been secretly longing for? His words hung in the air between us like a question neither of us could answer. This feels wrong, doesn't it? Jack's voice cracked slightly as he said it, the tension in his tone betraying the calm facade he was trying to maintain. Took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. My heart was thundering in my chest, and the overwhelming urge to say something, anything, was almost suffocating. My thoughts were all tangled, fighting for space, but only one thing stood clear. This wasn't just a moment of fleeting attraction. This was something more. Something deeper. Something I couldn't deny any longer. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to speak the truth. Not yet. I don't know. I finally managed, my voice quieter than I intended. My fingers trembled slightly, at my sides. I wasn't sure if it was from the cold air still clinging to my skin or something else entirely. Maybe it does feel wrong. I don't know. Jack exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, clearly torn. But I think about it. I can't help but think about it. About us. Every time you're around, I keep wondering if you feel it, too. His eyes, usually full of confidence, were now searching my face like he was looking for some kind of answer, something to make sense of this moment. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, my mouth dry, my mind racing. How could I answer him? How could I admit what I knew I was feeling? The yearning, the desire that had been growing inside me for so long, since before this trip, maybe even since the first time I laid eyes on him. I had always told myself that it was just a phase, just a harmless thing to think about in the dark corners of my mind. But now, with Jack standing so close, with that faint trace of vulnerability in his eyes, I couldn't hide from it anymore. I couldn't pretend. I felt it too. I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. But I felt his gaze on me, steady and intense. The confession felt like a weight lifted, but it also felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared, like I was suspended in midair, without anything to hold me up. Jack was silent for a long time. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I could hear the faintest breath escape from his chest. I finally dared to look at him, and when our eyes met, I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. It was there, deep in his eyes, mingling with the same heat I had felt between us before. Why didn't you say something earlier? His voice was softer now, quieter, like he was more to himself than speaking to me. Why didn't you tell me? I swallowed hard. Because I was scared, I said, the words spilling out more easily now. I didn't want to mess everything up. I didn't want to lose our friendship, Jack. It's too important to me. Jack took a step closer. He was close enough now that I could feel the warmth of his body radiating toward me. He reached up, his hand brushing against my cheek as if testing whether the contact would break us or bring us closer. His fingers lingered, warm and soft, and I could feel my pulse quicken. Do you know how many times I've wanted to tell you? To say something, anything, Jack said, his voice low and rough. But I thought if I did, you'd push me away. I thought if I told you how much I wanted you, how much I couldn't stop thinking about you, you'd never look at me the same. Way again, I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. His words were a confession in themselves, a confession of everything I had wanted but been too afraid to hear. But I do want you, Jack, I said, my voice barely more than a breath. I want this. I want us. The moment stretched between us, the air thick with the weight of what we were admitting, what we were allowing ourselves to feel. Jack's hand was still on my face, but his touch had changed. It wasn't the hesitant brush of earlier. It was firm, intentional, alive. He stepped forward, his body brushing against mine, and I felt every inch of the tension, every whisper of the chemistry that had been building between us. I could hear his breath, shallow and quick, just like mine, and for a second, it felt like time had stopped. And then, without another word, Jack kissed me. It was slow, hesitant at first, like he was testing the waters, unsure whether this was real or if he was still dreaming. But when my lips parted under his, when I kissed him back, something shifted. The hesitance faded, replaced by urgency, by a need we couldn't deny anymore. His hands moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss, as if he couldn't get enough. I felt dizzy, my head spinning with the heat of the moment, with the reality of everything that had just changed between us. The kiss was more than just physical. It was a confession, a promise, a release of everything we had held back for too long. I could taste the fear on his lips, but it was mingled with the sweetness of something more, something that had always been there but had been buried beneath layers of doubt and confusion. When we finally pulled away, our breaths ragged, I rested my forehead against his, our bodies still pressed together, both of us panting slightly. His hand moved to my chest, resting over my heart, and I could feel the rapid beat beneath his palm. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough, almost pleading. "Because I can't go back after this. I can't pretend anymore." I nodded, my hands reaching up to cup his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble, the heat radiating from his skin. "I'm sure," I whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." For a moment, everything was silent except for our breathing, our heartbeats sinking in a rhythm that felt right, that felt like the beginning of something new. I could hear the wind rustling outside, the world still turning, but it didn't matter. In that moment, it was just us, just Jack and me, standing in the middle of everything we had been too scared to admit, too afraid to embrace. "I want this too," Jack murmured, pulling me into another kiss, softer this time, but no less meaningful. It was a promise, an unspoken vow that things had changed between us, that we were no longer just friends. We were something more, something that could no longer be hidden. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel afraid. The quiet that settled after our kiss was like the calm after a storm, both soothing and surreal. My fingers were still tangled in his shirt, my breath coming in shallow bursts, as if I couldn't quite catch up to the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Jack's forehead was resting against mine, his hands gently caressing the sides of my face as though he couldn't quite believe that this us was real. I couldn't stop smiling. Not the wide, triumphant smile you'd expect after a confession, but a small, secretive one. It felt like I was floating, like I was waking up from a dream. But everything felt too right to be anything other than real. His eyes, still locked on mine, were full of that same wonder. They mirrored the mixture of emotions inside me: hope, excitement, fear, and above all, the certainty that something deep had shifted between us. "I can't believe we just did that," I whispered, my voice still a little shaky. I wasn't sure what was harder to believe, the kiss itself, or the fact that we were finally admitting what had been building for so long. Jack chuckled softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek as he leaned in closer. "I've wanted to for so long, but I wasn't sure if you felt the same." His voice was a little rougher than usual, still carrying that edge of disbelief. He kissed me again, just a light brush of his lips against mine, and I felt the jolt of electricity shoot through me once more. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. There was just us. The space between our bodies, which had once been a mile wide, now felt like a mere inch. The world outside seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of our breath, the soft shuffle of feet as we shifted closer together. I could feel the warmth of his chest against mine, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat matching my own. His hands found their way to my back, pulling me closer, and for a moment, it was like we were the only two people in the world. The only thing that mattered was this moment, this connection, this realization that what we shared wasn't a fleeting thing. It was something real, something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. "I've never felt anything like this before," Jack murmured, his voice low and almost reverent as his lips traced the line of my jaw. Not with anyone. It's like everything makes sense now, you know? I nodded. The words caught in my throat. I had never felt so seen, so understood. There was no need to explain, no need for awkwardness. He understood me without question, without hesitation. He felt the same way. I feel it too, I whispered back, pressing a kiss to his temple. I've always felt it. I just didn't know how to say it. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look me in the eye. His gaze was soft, but there was a strength in it, something I hadn't noticed before. You don't have to say anything anymore, not unless you want to, he said, his voice a little hoarse. I get it now. I get us. I couldn't stop the smile that spread across my face. It was like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying had been lifted, and suddenly, everything felt lighter. I felt like I could breathe again. The air around us seemed warmer, the world outside less daunting. There was something in the way Jack held me, in the way he looked at me, that made everything feel right. This wasn't some fleeting moment of passion. It was something deeper, something we could build together. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, filled with the promise of what was to come. I reached up to touch his face again, tracing the line of his jaw, his lips, committing every detail to memory like it was the first time I was really seeing him. I had always noticed his smile, the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. But now I saw the quiet strength in him too, the vulnerability beneath that easygoing facade. How do we even start? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question about what we'd do next. It was a question about how we moved forward from here, how we navigated this shift in our relationship. Jack looked down for a moment, his gaze softening before he lifted his head, his eyes locking with mine. Again, one step at a time, he said simply, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. We'll figure it out. We've been through enough together that we can handle whatever comes next. I leaned in to kiss him once more, this time slow and tender, as if we were both savoring the moment. There was no rush, no pressure, just the feeling of being here, of being present with him. His lips were warm, familiar, but now there was something new between us, something more than friendship, something that felt as if it was meant to be. When we pulled away, I couldn't help but laugh softly, my chest swelling with the giddiness I couldn't suppress. I think I've been waiting for this for a lot longer than I realized. Yeah? Jack raised an eyebrow, his smile turning mischievous. Well, I've been waiting for you to admit it. I rolled my eyes playfully, but the warmth in my chest only grew stronger. We didn't need to say anything else. Everything was in the way we held each other, in the way we knew now that this was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The future felt open, full of possibilities, and with Jack beside me, I was ready to take whatever came next, together. The night stretched on, and as we stood there, holding each other in the quiet, there was a sense of peace between us. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from the absence of conflict, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Jack's fingers traced the small of my back in slow, rhythmic motions. A subtle, calming gesture that grounded me. The world outside our little bubble of warmth and closeness didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this moment, our moment. Are you sure? I asked, my voice soft, almost hesitant. I didn't want to ruin this, not when everything felt so perfectly in place. But a small part of me needed reassurance. The uncertainty I'd carried for so long, the fear of what this would mean for us, for our friendship, for everything, still lingered just beneath the surface. Jack tilted his head slightly, looking down at me with a steady gaze that calmed the fluttering in my chest. Yeah, he said, his voice firm and sure. I'm sure. I wouldn't have kissed you if I wasn't. He gave me a small smile, his thumb brushing across my cheek. You don't need to worry. I'm not going anywhere. I closed my eyes. For a moment, allowing his words to sink in. There was a weight to them, something in the way he said them that made me believe him. He wasn't just saying the words to calm me down. He meant them, and that meant everything. When I opened my eyes again, Jack was still there, his expression warm, open. He looked at me the way I'd always wanted someone to look at me, with that quiet understanding, with the unspoken promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. I felt the rush of affection surge through me once more. "I'm glad you're not going anywhere," I whispered, my voice thick with the emotion I couldn't quite name. Jack grinned, that familiar, easy smile returning. Me neither. The silence between us was comfortable now, filled with the promise of something deeper. Something that had just begun but already felt so natural. Like we were two pieces that fit perfectly together. I reached up and brushed a lock of hair from his face, my fingers lingering against his skin. It was a simple touch, but it felt so significant, like an unspoken declaration of what we both wanted, what we both needed. "We'll figure this out," I said, my voice more confident now. "We don't need all the answers right away. We've got time." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, we do. But I'm not going anywhere, okay? I meant what I said. We'll take it one step at a time." I smiled, the weight in my chest lifting even more. One step at a time. That was all we could do, and that was enough. We didn't need to have everything figured out. We didn't need to know exactly where this was going. As long as we had each other, as long as we were willing to take those steps together, everything would fall into place. "Do you want to go for a walk?" I asked after a few beats of silence. The night was still young, and the world outside, our little sanctuary, felt wide and open, full of possibilities. I wanted to be close to him, to share this newfound connection with him in whatever way we could. Jack smiled and nodded. "Yeah. Let's go." We stepped outside together, our hands brushing once more before our fingers found each other, threading together like they were always meant to. We walked side by side, the cool night air gentle against our skin, the quiet hum of the world around us, almost soothing. "I don't know what the future holds," I said after a while, my voice quiet but sure. "But I know I want to find out. With you." Jack squeezed my hand. "Me too. We'll figure it out. Together." And as we walked under the soft glow of the streetlights, the future didn't seem so daunting anymore. There were still questions to be answered, challenges to face, but now we were no longer facing them alone. We had each other. And with that simple, undeniable truth, I knew everything would be all right. This was just the beginning.